Welcome back to another video, and in this video we're going to be continuing on with our SwiftUI tutorial series, and in this particular tutorial we are going to be taking a look at the observable macro. Now, the observable macro is a new way of managing state in SwiftUI. It was introduced in iOS 17 along with macros in Swift. It's a brand new feature that pretty much you can think of it as a way of sneakily adding new bits of code to your own code behind the scenes. If you are familiar with C++ and C and stuff, macros may be familiar to you already. And you might be surprised that Swift just got macros a year ago, but that's neither here nor there. So, how do we get started using Observable? Well, the first thing that we need to do is we need to understand what the observable macro exactly does. So the observable macro works similarly to an observable object, except not all the bits of state are updated and managed and kept alive by, say, @StateObject. The observable macro does all the heavy lifting. It does. It makes sure that only views that reference a bit of state that was changed gets re-rendered when it needs to be re-rendered. It makes sure that it monitors all the properties inside of a class that is marked @observable without needing a separate property wrapper, so we no longer would need @published. And all of that stuff. And in addition, we don't need StateObject anymore. We can use the normal @state property wrapper with objects that are marked @observable. The big difference there being that that @state doesn't manage the actual state management, the changes, the listening for changes, and all that stuff. It just serves to keep the object alive at that point. So, let's go ahead and get started with using @observable. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to go down to our object that is conforming to observable object. So I'm going to go all the way up to the class definition here. So here we are in our class definition where we have class, contact, and then we have it conforming to observable object and identifiable. Let's get rid of that observable object conformance. And we're going to get rid of the comma there. Now, we're going to get a bunch of errors because we got rid of the observable object conformance. However, we are going to remedy that slightly by adding the observable macro to our class definition. So, next to the class definition or above it or whatever, it doesn't matter. You can say @observable. Now, if you want to expand this macro to see the code that it's actually using to do all this stuff, at the top of your view or at the top of your file for your model that has the observable macro in it, you need to add the import for observation, and then you can do it. You don't need the import observation line to use the observable macro, but if you want to expand it and look inside of it, you do. So just keep that in mind. Now, we've fixed some of our errors, but not all of them. Now, state object and observed object are going to whine and say, oh, well, the contact needs to conform to observable object in order to use it here. Well, that's fine. We can make those necessary changes. But before we do, we need to get rid of @published for all of the properties inside of this class. Now, of course, with @observable, this also means that our ID property is going to be tracked for changes, but it's not going to matter too much unless you actually change change that property. You can get rid of it if you want to, but I'm going to keep it in there. So let's get rid of @published. So now it's just, there we go. Alright, we're going to get rid of that here. And there we go. Now all of the variables, all the properties inside of contact no longer have @published applied to them. And we're almost done. We're about halfway there. Inside of our content view, where we have our form, I'm going to change this from state object to @state. There we go. Now that isn't going to yell at us. However, the last change we need to make is we need to change the observed object property inside of our name entry view and contact info entry view to be a property marked as @binding. And then we can pass the contact in as a binding to monitor for changes that way. So to do this, let's go ahead and first go to our name entry view, and where we are passing it contact, add a $sign there. Same thing here, where we have our contact info entry view. Add a $sign. Now, the text field and the toggle can be left alone because that's still correct in terms of referencing a property in for state management. And now instead of contact info entry view, instead of @observed object, we can say @binding, like that. And then same thing inside of name entry view. Instead of @observed object, it'll be @binding. And there we go. Now we've fixed all of our issues, and we're now migrated over to iOS 17, macOS 14, and all those previous, all those versions of Apple's operating systems to use kind of a newer state management feature. Now, I want to emphasize, you do not need to use the observable macro. If you want to keep your observable objects, you can. It just really depends on on the requirements of your application, what operating systems you need to support, and all of that stuff. So, if you can't use observable, don't sweat it. Observable object, state object, and observed object are not deprecated, so you can still use them safely without issue. Let's save our code. We have a successful build. So first name, let's say it's going to be, let's say Mike again. And we have Mike now in there. We have A, let's say. And for our last name, we'll say Jones. Email is going to say mjones@example.com. Phone number, we'll use the same all zeros here. 000 0000. Again, I know it's not a valid phone number, but it's test data. Address, let's say 1 Infinite Loop Cupertino. Cupertino, CA. Again, if you're read into kind of the Apple history and stuff, at this, like, if you're read into Apple history, you'll know that address. But again, that's neither here nor there. Like last time where we used the White House address as test data. And then we have our favorite, so we can mark that, unmark it, mark it as needed, and there we go. So we're able to manage state using the observable macro pretty simply. That pretty much does it for this video on the observable macro in SwiftUI. Thank you all so very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.